On the evening of April 14, 1912, the most ambitious engineering marvel of the Edwardian era was cutting through the glass-like surface of the North Atlantic at a relentless pace. The sky was an obsidian dome, pierced by stars that seemed too bright to be real, casting a cold glitter over the water. Inside the hull of the RMS Titanic, over 2,000 souls were drifting into sleep, cocooned in a misplaced sense of absolute safety. They were unaware that within hours, their names would be etched into history as victims of one of the greatest maritime tragedies of all time. Among the crowds of aristocrats, immigrants, and crew members, there was a man whose presence challenged the social structures of the era. His name was Joseph-Philippe Lemercier Laroche. He was 25 years old, a brilliant polyglot, and a trained engineer. For nearly a century, his identity was a footnote, a ghost in the archives of the White Star Line. He was the only black man aboard the Titanic, yet his face was absent from the films and documentaries that shaped the world's memory of that night. It wasn't until his daughter, at the age of 84, finally chose to speak that the world realized the depth of the story they had forgotten. It is a chronicle defined by profound love and the harsh reality of early 20th century racism, beginning in a house in Haiti that smelled of roasted coffee and the salt of the Caribbean Sea. Joseph's journey did not start on the deck of a doomed luxury liner, but in the coastal city of Cap Haitien, Haiti, on May 26, 1886. While Haiti was a nation still navigating the turbulent waters of political instability following its independence, Joseph's upbringing was one of relative privilege and intellectual rigor. His father was a former military officer with deep ties to the government, and his mother, Thérèse Elizabeth Josephine, came from a family of high social standing. Their home was a sanctuary of culture, where French was the language of the dinner table and the bookshelves were filled with European literature and scientific journals. From a young age, Joseph displayed a mind that was never satisfied with simple answers. He was the child who would meticulously disassemble a clock just to map the dance of its internal gears. He spent his afternoons at the harbor, watching the great iron hulls of merchant ships rise and fall with the tide, his young mind trying to calculate the physics of buoyancy and displacement. His mother watched him with a mixture of pride and anxiety. She knew that his curiosity was a fire that required a broader horizon than Haiti could provide at the time. She harbored a singular ambition for her son. He was to become an engineer of the highest caliber, trained in Europe, so that he might one day return to help build the infrastructure of his homeland. In the year 1901, at the tender age of 15, Joseph boarded a steamship bound for France, carrying little more than a suitcase and a letter of recommendation. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks, and the young boy spent much of it alone on the deck, staring at the horizon where the blue of the sea met the grey of the unknown. When he finally stepped onto the docks of La Rochelle, the world he encountered was a jarring contrast to the tropical warmth of Haiti. He was a teenager in a foreign land, a solitary black face in a sea of white. He traveled north to Beauvais, a town about 80 kilometers from Paris, where he would dedicate the next several years of his life to the pursuit of knowledge. The winters were his first true adversary. The biting cold of northern France was a physical shock to a boy raised in the Caribbean sun. Yet, Joseph did not waver. He rented a small, Spartan room and threw himself into his studies with a discipline that bordered on obsession. He mastered French grammar until his writing surpassed that of his native peers and conquered the complexities of mathematics and technical drawing. He knew that as a black man in Europe, excellence was not just a goal, it was his only defense. He believed that a diploma from a prestigious French institution would be a shield against prejudice, a document that would force the world to see his mind instead of his skin. Upon graduating with his engineering degree, Joseph entered the professional world with the optimism of youth and the credentials of a scholar. However, the reality of the early 1900s was a cold wake-up call. Despite his fluency, his intellect, and his formal qualifications, the doors of the great engineering firms remained firmly shut. In the salons of Paris and the offices of construction giants, the discrimination was not always loud or violent. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and insurmountable. Joseph would arrive for interviews only to be told the position had just been filled, or he would submit impeccable designs only to have them ignored. While France did not have the explicit Jim Crow laws of the United States, there was an unspoken ceiling that Joseph hit every time he tried to rise. He was forced to accept low-paying menial positions that insulted his training, working twice as hard as his white colleagues for half the recognition. He was a man of the future living in a society still anchored to the prejudices of the past. It was during this period of professional stagnation and growing disillusionment that he met Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue in the town of Villejuif. Juliette was the daughter of a local wine merchant, a woman of grace and soft features who looked at Joseph and saw exactly what the engineering firms refused to see, a man of immense character, kindness, and untapped potential. Their romance was an act of quiet rebellion. In 1908, a relationship between a black Haitian man and a white French woman was a scandal waiting to happen. Juliette's father, conscious of his reputation as a merchant, initially resisted the union, fearing the social and economic repercussions of such a marriage. But Juliette was immovable in her devotion. She saw in Joseph a depth of soul that transcended the surface-level judgments of their neighbors. She wanted to know about the mountains of Haiti, the rhythm of the drums in Cap Haitien, and the dreams Joseph still carried in his heart. After months of persistence, her father eventually relented, perhaps moved by the undeniable sincerity of their bond. On March 18, 1908, they were married in a modest ceremony, marking the beginning of a partnership that would face the ultimate test of survival. The early years of their marriage were a blend of domestic joy and external hardship. Even with a family to support, Joseph found that his professional path remained blocked. The birth of their first daughter, Simone, in 1909, followed by the frail, premature Louise in 1910, brought both light and immense financial pressure into their lives. By 1912, with a third child on the way and the mounting medical bills for Louise's care, Joseph realized that the promise of France had become a cage. He made the monumental decision to return to Haiti, a place where his degree would be respected and his children could grow up without the shadow of European bias. By the dawn of 1912, the atmosphere in the Laroche household was a mixture of quiet desperation and flickering hope. Joseph was working grueling hours in positions that failed to utilize his engineering prowess, while Juliette managed their small home and the specialized needs of their young daughters. The news of a third pregnancy brought a complex wave of emotion. It was a blessing they cherished, but also a stark reminder of their precarious financial situation. Little Louise still required medical attention that stretched their meager resources to the breaking point. Joseph realized that if they remained in France, his children would grow up in a society that saw them as outsiders, regardless of their talents. He began to envision a different future in Haiti. There, his mother's influence and his own French credentials would finally carry the weight they deserved. In his mind, Haiti was not just a destination. It was a sanctuary where his family could thrive without the crushing weight of European prejudice. He wrote to his mother, Thérèse, explaining the situation and his desire to return home. Her response was immediate and filled with maternal joy. She offered to pay for their passage, seeing this as the long-awaited homecoming of her brilliant son. She purchased first-class tickets for the family on the upcoming French liner, the SS France, which was set to depart in April. It seemed as though the stars were finally aligning for the Laroche family. However, a sudden complication arose that challenged Joseph's core values as a father. While reviewing the regulations of the SS France, he discovered a policy that he found deeply unsettling. Children were not permitted to dine with their parents. They were required to stay in a supervised nursery during mealtimes, isolated from the family unit. To many aristocratic passengers of the era, this was a standard convenience. But to Joseph, it was an unacceptable separation. He had spent years fighting to keep his family together against the tide of social exclusion. He was not about to let a shipping company dictate when he could hold his daughters. He wanted to see Simone's eyes light up at the sight of new foods and be there to comfort Louise if the vibration of the engines frightened her. His role as a father was not a part-time commitment, and he refused to settle for a voyage that marginalized his children. Without hesitation, he returned to the ticket office and requested a refund. In a twist of fate that would change the course of their lives, he discovered that the RMS Titanic, the newest and most celebrated vessel of the White Star Line, was preparing for its maiden voyage. The Titanic's policies were different. In second class, the family could remain together. Joseph exchanged the first-class berths on the SS France for second-class passage on the unsinkable Giant. It was a decision made out of love, intended to ensure their comfort and unity. On April 10, 1912, the La Roche family arrived in the bustling port of Cherbourg. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and sea salt, vibrating with the collective energy of hundreds of travelers embarking on a historic journey. Because of the Titanic's massive displacement, it could not dock directly at the pier, requiring passengers to be ferried out by smaller tenders. The La Roche family boarded the SS Nomadic, a sturdy white and buff vessel that served as the bridge between the shore and the Titan waiting in the harbour. Joseph stood on the deck of the tender, holding Louise tightly against his chest, while Simone clutched Juliet's hand. As the Nomadic rounded the breakwater, the Titanic finally came into view. It was a sight that defied the imagination of even a trained engineer like Joseph. The hull rose from the water like a mountain of black steel, a sheer cliff face of industrial might that seemed to dwarf the very ocean it sat upon. The four massive funnels leaned back with an air of speed and grace, and the rows of portholes glittered like diamonds in the fading afternoon light. To Joseph, the ship looked like a promise made manifest, a solid, ironclad guarantee that they would reach the shores of the new world safely. He felt a rare sense of peace as they ascended the gangway. For the first time in years, he felt the world was finally moving in his direction. Their accommodations on Deck E were a far cry from the cramped apartment they had left behind in Villejuif. The cabin was bright and meticulously clean, with crisp linens and a sense of order that appealed to Joseph's engineering mind. As they settled in, the deep, resonant thrum of the Titanic's engines began to vibrate through the floorboards, a rhythmic heartbeat that signaled the start of their 5-day crossing to New York. The first few days at sea were a surreal interlude of luxury and tranquility. In the second-class dining saloon, surrounded by polished oak and fine crystal, the family enjoyed meals that surpassed anything they had experienced in France. Joseph felt a surge of pride as he sat with his wife and daughters, finally able to provide them with the elegance they deserved. He watched the white-jacketed stewards move with practiced efficiency and listened to the distant strains of the ship's orchestra. For a brief window of time, the social barriers that had defined his life in Europe seemed to vanish. On this ship, he was not just a black man in a white world, he was a husband, a father, and a passenger on the greatest vessel ever built. He spent his mornings walking the deck, breathing in the frigid Atlantic air and looking toward the west, where a new life awaited them in the Caribbean. Yet, even in the middle of the ocean, the complexities of the human condition remained. While the Titanic was a marvel of technology, it was still a microcosm of the world's social hierarchies. Joseph was acutely aware of the glances from his fellow passengers, some filled with simple curiosity, others with a cold, unmistakable judgment. In 1912, a biracial family of such poise and education was a rarity that many struggled to process. Joseph heard the hushed whispers in the corridors and saw the way some women pulled their skirts aside as they passed. One passenger even remarked that the children looked Japanese, unable to categorize their heritage within her narrow worldview. Joseph met these moments with a quiet, impenetrable dignity. He had spent a lifetime refining the art of ignoring the ignorant. He did not seek to confront or complain. His focus was entirely on Juliet and the girls. He wanted this voyage to be a memory of beauty for them, untainted by the prejudices of the land. On the evening of April 14th, after a peaceful day that included a Sunday prayer service, Joseph tucked his daughters into bed and shared a quiet moment with Juliet. They talked of the mountains of Haiti and the home they would build. They were 4 days into the voyage, and New York was almost within reach. The world was quiet, the sea was flat, and the unsinkable ship moved forward into the dark. At 11:40 p.m. on the night of April 14th, the serene atmosphere of the RMS Titanic was shattered by a sensation so subtle it was almost ghostly. Joseph was in the second-class smoking room, a space of dark wood and quiet conversation, when he felt a strange grinding shudder vibrate through the soles of his shoes. It wasn't a violent impact. It felt more like the ship had scraped against a giant velvet cushion. To an engineer's trained ear, however, the change in the ship's rhythm was immediate and alarming. The deep, reassuring throb of the reciprocating engines suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence that seemed to expand throughout the hull. Men at the card tables paused, their drinks held mid-air, looking at one another with raised eyebrows. Some joked about a thrown propeller or a minor mechanical hiccup, but Joseph felt a cold prickle of intuition. He stepped out onto the deck, where the air had turned sharp enough to sting the lungs. The ocean was unnervingly flat, like a sheet of dark glass, and scattered across the deck were white, crystalline fragments that caught the ship's lights. He reached down and picked up a piece of ice. It was solid and freezing. Looking over the starboard railing, he glimpsed a mountain of white, fading into the darkness behind the ship. The unsinkable Titanic had just brushed against the edge of eternity. Joseph didn't wait for an official announcement. He knew the physics of the sea and the vulnerability of even the strongest steel. He ran back toward the cabin on Deck E, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The corridors were still mostly quiet, but the tilt of the floor was beginning to shift, a nearly imperceptible lean toward the bow. When he burst into the room, Juliet was sitting up, her eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly sharpening into fear. She was 7 months pregnant, and the sudden disruption of the night had left her disoriented. Joseph spoke with a calm authority that masked his rising panic, telling her to dress the children in their warmest layers. He didn't waste time explaining the iceberg. He simply focused on the immediate necessity of survival. As Juliet pulled thick wool coats over their nightgowns, Joseph reached for the life jackets stored atop the wardrobe. They were bulky, awkward things made of cork and canvas, and as he fastened the straps around his wife's trembling frame, the reality of their situation became undeniable. He woke Simone and Louise, who were still heavy with sleep, their small faces crumpled in protest at the sudden intrusion of the cold. He held them close, trying to transfer his own warmth to them, while the distant sound of rushing water began to echo through the ship's lower reaches. The journey from their cabin to the boat deck was a harrowing ascent through a maze that was slowly turning into a trap. The stewards were now moving through the halls, their voices artificially cheerful as they rapped on doors, telling passengers to head upstairs as a precaution. Joseph saw through the facade. He saw the way the stewards' eyes darted toward the end of the hallways and the way they gripped their clipboards until their knuckles turned white. The crowd in the stairwells was growing, a sea of silk robes and expensive overcoats mixed with the plain wool of the second class. There was no screaming yet, only a tense, vibrating silence broken by the occasional sob or the metallic groan of the ship's hull under immense pressure. Joseph carried Louise, her small body shaking with a chill that no coat could repel, while Juliet clutched Simon's hand with a grip born of pure maternal instinct. The air grew colder with every deck they climbed, and the smell of the ocean, salty, raw, and indifferent, seemed to be rising from the floors. Joseph pushed forward, his engineering mind calculating the increasing angle of the deck. He knew they were running out of time before the gravity of the sinking bow made the stairs impassable. When they finally emerged onto the boat deck, the scene was one of surreal, brightly lit chaos. The ship's powerful arc lamps cast long, flickering shadows across the white-painted lifeboats. The orchestra had begun to play on the deck, the jaunty notes of ragtime and popular hymns clashing violently with the terrifying reality of the situation. It was a psychological tactic to prevent a stampede, but to Joseph, it felt like the soundtrack to a fever dream. Officers were shouting orders, their breath misting in the freezing air as they struggled with the complex series of ropes and pulleys known as davits. "Women and children first," the cry went up, echoing the ancient code of the sea. Joseph looked at the lifeboats and then at the dark, freezing expanse of the Atlantic below. There were not enough boats for everyone. The math was simple and devastating. He led his family toward Lifeboat 9, pushing through the press of bodies with a desperate strength. He could see the fear in Juliet's eyes, a silent plea for him to stay with them, to not let the darkness separate what they had built together. But the officers were firm, and the social order of the time was absolute. Men were expected to stand back, to provide the buffer between the living and the abyss. The moment of separation was a jagged wound in the fabric of their lives. As Lifeboat 9 was readied for lowering, Joseph helped Juliet over the high gunwale. The transfer was clumsy. Juliet's pregnancy made her movement slow, and the boat swayed precariously over the black water 70 feet below. He handed Simone to her, the little girl's cries lost in the roar of steam venting from the ship's funnels. Then came the moment that would haunt their family for generations. In the frantic rush to fill the boat, Joseph tried to hand Louise to Juliet, but the boat began to jerk downward, the ropes creaking under the weight. A crewman, stressed and blinded by the prejudice of the era, blocked Joseph's path, assuming he was trying to jump into the boat himself. For a terrifying several seconds, Louise remained in Joseph's arms on the deck while her mother and sister were in the boat, descending toward the sea. Juliet's screams were primal, a sound of pure agony that pierced through the noise of the ship. Joseph, realizing he could not reach the boat, turned to a woman standing near the rail, a total stranger, and thrust his daughter into her arms, begging her to get the child to her mother. It was a chain of human hands, a series of desperate reaches over the railing, until Louise was finally dropped into Juliet's waiting arms. Joseph stood at the rail, his chest heaving, watching the boat disappear into the shadows. As the lifeboat carrying his world descended into the shadows, Joseph Laroche stood at the railing, a solitary figure framed by the brilliant, indifferent stars. The deck beneath his feet was now a steep, treacherous slope, and the groan of the ship's internal structure sounded like the death rattle of a giant. He watched the small, white boat shrink into the darkness until it was nothing more than a speck on the obsidian water. The transition from the frantic energy of the evacuation to this sudden, hollow solitude was jarring. Around him, the remaining men stood in various states of resignation. Some were stoic, while others were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of their fate. Joseph walked back toward the second-class smoking room, his movements slow and deliberate. The room was a ghost of its former self, the fine cigars and mahogany now tilted at an angle that signaled the end of the Edwardian dream. He sat in a chair, feeling the weight of the Atlantic pushing against the hull somewhere below. He was a man who had built his life on the principles of logic, mathematics, and structural integrity, yet he was currently trapped on a monument to human arrogance that was failing every law of physics he had ever studied. In those final, freezing minutes, the engineering degree he had fought so hard to obtain in France was useless, but the love that had driven him to board this ship was the only thing that felt solid. In the quiet of the dying ship, Joseph's mind drifted back across the ocean to the sun-drenched streets of Cap Haitien. He thought of his mother, Thérèse, and the promise he had made to return and help rebuild their nation. He reflected on his 25 years, a life defined by the pursuit of excellence in a world that often refused to acknowledge his humanity. He had crossed the Atlantic as a teenager to master the secrets of iron and steam, only to find that the invisible walls of prejudice were more difficult to dismantle than any physical structure. He thought of the indignities he had endured in Paris, the closed doors, and the hushed whispers, and how all of it had been worth it because it led him to Juliet. He realized that his sacrifice tonight was the ultimate expression of his engineering mind. He had calculated the risks, assessed the weight of his responsibilities, and chosen the only path that guaranteed the survival of his lineage. He thought of the child Juliet was still carrying, a son or daughter who would never know the sound of his voice or the warmth of his hands. A profound, aching sadness washed over him, not for the life he was losing, but for the milestones he would never witness. He closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer in French, the language of his education, and in Creole, the language of his heart, entrusting his family to the mercy of the sea and the strength of the woman he loved. The end came with a violence that no survivor could ever truly describe. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the Titanic's lights flickered one last time and then vanished, plunging the thousands still on board into a terrifying, absolute darkness. The stern of the ship rose into the air, silhouetted against the starry sky like a jagged mountain peak, before the unimaginable stress caused the hull to snap in two. The roar was deafening, a symphony of screaming metal, crashing furniture, and the thunderous ingress of the ocean. Joseph Laroche, along with more than 1,500 others, was cast into the North Atlantic. The water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature so extreme that it felt like 1,000 knives piercing the skin simultaneously. In such cold, the body's system shut down within minutes. The heart slows, the lungs seize, and the mind retreats into a final, icy fog. Joseph's physical form was swallowed by the deep, his body never to be recovered by the cable ships that would later scour the area for the dead. He became part of the silence of the abyss, his story sinking beneath the waves alongside the grand staircases and the boilers. For 83 years, his name would remain a secret held by the silt and the currents. an invisible passenger in a tragedy that the world thought it understood perfectly. He died as he had lived, with dignity, with courage, and with an unwavering focus on the safety of those who carried his heart. From the vantage point of Lifeboat 9, the destruction of the Titanic was a spectacle of horror that defied human comprehension. Juliet sat huddled with her daughters, her body acting as a shield against the biting wind that whipped across the open water. She watched in stunned silence as the great ship, which had looked so invincible just hours before, began its final vertical plunge. The sound of the sinking was a low, rhythmic thumping, followed by a chorus of cries that rose from the water, a sound she would later describe as 1,000 voices calling out in a singular, desperate prayer. As the ship disappeared beneath the surface, a terrible, heavy silence descended over the Atlantic. The water was so still it seemed impossible that it had just swallowed a world. Juliet's eyes never left the spot where the Titanic had vanished, her mind refusing to accept that Joseph wasn't in one of the other boats. She called his name into the darkness, her voice thin and fragile against the vastness of the sea, but only the slap of the waves against the boat's side answered her. Simone and Louise clung to her, their small bodies shaking with a cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. Throughout the long, frigid night, Juliet held them close, her prayers a constant, whispered litany. She was a woman suspended between two lives, the one she had shared with Joseph in the light, and the one she would now have to forge in the shadow of his absence. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, a new silhouette appeared on the water. It was the RMS Carpathia, a ship that had raced through the ice fields at a suicidal speed to reach the site of the disaster. For the survivors in the lifeboats, the sight of the Carpathia's smokestacks was the first sign of hope in a night of total despair. One by one, the boats were pulled alongside the rescue ship, and the freezing passengers were hauled up the side in slings and chairs. Juliet was carried aboard, her pregnant body heavy and exhausted, her daughters clutched tightly by the crew. Once on deck, she immediately began her frantic search. She walked through the rows of shivering survivors, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for the one man who made her world complete. She asked the officers, the stewards, and the other widows if they had seen a black man from the second class, an engineer from Haiti. But as the Carpathia completed its rounds and began the slow journey toward New York, the realization finally took hold. Joseph was not among the rescued. The man who had given up his seat so his family could live was gone, and the silence of the North Atlantic had claimed him forever. Juliet sat on the floor of the Carpathia's dining room, her head bowed, as the ship moved away from the graveyard of the Titanic, carrying her toward a future she had never imagined. The RMS Carpathia arrived at New York's Pier 54 on the rainy evening of April 18, 1912, greeted by a somber crowd of 30,000 people. For Juliet LaRoche, the city of skyscrapers was not the land of opportunity Joseph had described, but a cold, grey purgatory. At 25 years old, 7 months pregnant and clutching 2 traumatized toddlers, she was a widow in a foreign land that was deeply segregated. While the White Star Line and various charities provided immediate relief, Juliet felt the crushing weight of her isolation. She was a French woman whose life had been anchored to a Haitian visionary, and without him, the dream of continuing to Haiti felt impossible. She spent several weeks in a fog of grief, waiting near the docks as if the ocean might still surrender the man it had taken. But as the lists of recovered bodies were posted and Joseph's name remained absent, the reality settled into her bones like the North Atlantic chill. She made the agonizing decision to abandon the journey to the Caribbean and return to the only sanctuary she had left, her father's home in France. The promise that was never kept, the return to the house that smelled of coffee and sea salt, became a haunting refrain in her heart. She boarded a ship back across the same waters that had claimed her husband, every wave a reminder of the night the world broke. Returning to Villejuif was a journey into a different kind of shadow. On December 17, 1912, 8 months after the sinking, Juliet gave birth to a healthy son whom she named Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche Jr. The boy was a biological miracle, the mirror image of the father he would never meet. He had the same dark, intelligent eyes and the same resolute expression that had once graced the engineering halls of Beauvais. For Juliet, looking at her son was both a comfort and a quiet torture. He was a living testament to a love that had been cut short by a mountain of ice. She never remarried, choosing instead to dedicate her entire existence to the survival and education of her 3 children. She took on menial jobs, working until her hands were raw to ensure that Simone, Louise, and young Joseph Jr. had the opportunities their father had dreamed of. She buried the trauma of the Titanic deep within her soul, building a wall of silence so thick that even her children knew not to ask about the big ship. The suitcases from the voyage remained locked away, and the memories of the freezing deck were treated like a family secret too dangerous to expose to the light. Juliet lived for nearly 70 more years, a guardian of a history that the rest of the world was slowly erasing. As the decades passed, the Titanic transformed from a tragedy into a global myth. It became the subject of epic films, glossy books, and endless academic debates. Yet in every retelling, the narrative remained curiously monochromatic. The world's memory of the unsinkable ship was populated by Edwardian millionaires and Irish immigrants, while the story of the brilliant Haitian engineer was systematically ignored. History, in its pursuit of a specific aesthetic, had essentially erased Joseph Laroche from the manifest of human memory. He was a ghost in the archives, a name that didn't fit the simplified stories society wanted to tell about 1912. Simone grew up with fragmented, terrifying memories of the cold and the screams, while Louise, who had been passed from hand to hand by strangers to reach the lifeboat, remembered nothing but the stories her mother eventually whispered in the dark. Joseph Jr. grew into a man who carried his father's name with a quiet pride, yet even he lived in the shadow of a father who was officially forgotten by the history books. The Laroche family lived through 2 world wars and the turn of a new century, maintaining their private dignity, while the rest of the world watched fictionalized versions of their nightmare on the silver screen. The silence finally broke in 1995. Louise Laroche was 84 years old, living in a modest Paris apartment surrounded by the ghosts of a century. When the Titanic Historical Society reached out to her, she realized that she was one of the last living bridges to that fateful night. She decided that the world had ignored her father's sacrifice for long enough. In a series of emotional interviews, she poured out the details that had been locked away since 1912. The engineering brilliance of Joseph, the systemic racism he had fought in France, the reason they had exchanged their tickets for the Titanic, and the final, selfless act of a father who ensured his daughters reached the lifeboat while he stayed behind. Her testimony sent shockwaves through the historical community. It forced a global reckoning with the fact that the Titanic was not just a story of class and hubris, but also a story of a black family navigating a world that sought to limit them at every turn. Louise's voice, though aged and fragile, was powerful enough to dismantle 83 years of historical erasure. She died in 1998, but not before she saw her father's name finally etched into the permanent record of the ship's legacy. Today, the story of Joseph-Philippe Lemercier Laroche is no longer hidden. His photograph, showing a man of immense poise and intellect, now hangs in museums and features in exhibitions from Paris to New York. He is recognized not just as a victim, but as a hero, a man who defied the prejudices of his era to become an engineer and who gave his life so that his lineage could flourish in a new world. The promise of Haiti was never kept in his lifetime, but his children and grandchildren became the realization of his dreams. They became the bridge he never got to build. His story serves as a profound reminder that history is often written by those who choose what to remember. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface, much like the wreckage of the ship itself. Joseph was a father, a husband, and a scholar who looked at the greatest ship in the world and saw only a way to keep his family together. The North Atlantic may hold his remains, but it could not hold his name forever. He stands now as a symbol of love, sacrifice, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, a man who was once lost to the sea, but who finally, through the courage of his daughter, found his way back to the world.